Hello, everybody. It is Saturday, February the 28th, 2026, last day in February. And our Saturday show, our summary of tech news from Silicon Valley. There's only really one story this week. It's the statement from Dario Amodei of Anthropic in terms of his quote-unquote discussions with the Department of War. They weren't very successful discussions. Amodei has decided not to allow the Department of War to use some of his best technology. A lot of people in Silicon Valley very sympathetic to Anthropic in this clash with not just the Department of War, but Donald Trump, of course. Silicon Valley rallies behind Anthropic, according to the New York Times. Lots of people at big tech companies like Google and Meta are supportive. Not everyone, though, is supportive of what Amodei, the position he's taken. Vinod Khosla says that he's sympathetic in a way with what Amodei is doing, but disagree with the principle itself. And Keith Teare of That Was the Week, I think, agrees with Khosla, although his editorial this week came out before the Khosla X's. Keith leads this week with Anthropic is wrong. Keith, why is Dario Amodei wrong? What's your position on this?
Well, he clearly hasn't read The Art of War. How do you win? He's blundered here. He's trying to set policy for the government on use of AI through a sales contract. And firstly, it's not his job to do that. Vendors don't determine the use of the thing you buy from them. And by doing it, he's obviously alienated the entire US administration, which means a huge customer base. And the reality is that the likelihood of the government misusing his AI due to the rule of law, firstly, it's out of his control. And secondly, it's very unlikely they would anyway. So he's created a fake battle that can only damage his company.
But these aren't normal political times, Keith. If it was Anthropic challenging the Biden government or the Bush government or the Obama one, you may have a point. But at what point then, in your view, should or would Anthropic not allow the government to use his technology? You have to assume that there's a political dimension here. That he doesn't mention in his statement Trump and Hegseth, but it's clearly there. It's self-evident in his challenge to the administration.
Yeah. Look, if the better option would be to just decide we don't sell to governments. You can't sell to a government and then, when the government says any lawful use, which is an important sentence, say, well, no, we want to carve out these things you can't do, and expect that a government is going to allow a private company or even a public company to determine government policy. It's just unrealistic. And so he's naive. And I'm with Vinod. I'm not in favor of mass surveillance, and I'm not in favor of even narrow surveillance. And I'm certainly not in favor of autonomous weapons making kill decisions at a time when the software itself is not reliably deterministic. So I don't disagree with Amodei's, let's call him his concerns. I'm giving him some business advice here. The best way to pursue his concerns isn't to do what he did.
But that's all very well. He doesn't need business advice from you. He's quite enough of a grown-up, I think. And this is not a business decision. It's obviously not a business decision. He's taking a position against the Trump administration, for better or worse. So if you want to argue on business terms, you're obviously right. If you want to make money, you sell as much of your technology as you can. But that's not the position he's taking.
Well, it isn't money. My main point isn't about money. It's about who controls policy. And that's more of a point about democracy. None of us want private companies to make policy. they're allowed to be lobbyists. They're allowed to have opinions. They're not policymakers. So policy belongs with the legislature and the people who elect them. And there is no current fear that the legal system doesn't protect us against mass surveillance of the US population, because as we've seen in recent history, there are laws against that, but the government does it anyway. The guy who had to go to Moscow, what's his name?
Witkoff?
No, the guy who was a Secret Service guy who leaked that there was mass surveillance going on with the British government in cahoots. Very famous guy.
Famous we can't remember his name.
Anyway, that guy. So there's a long history of mass surveillance. We know it happens. Anthropic isn't going to have any impact at all on the reality of that. So it's a fake misfire by Ahmadai. I'd be fine if he just said we're not selling to governments. That's our policy. I don't have a problem with that. It's trying to set policy that's a problem.
So I wonder, I take your point, but this was a week when OpenAI, Anthropic's competitor, raised $110 billion, the largest private funding round in history. Altman apparently reached a deal with the government, the kind of deal that Ahmadai rejected. But I wonder, in retrospect, Keith, whether this might speak to the change in power between corporations and the state. I mean, you keep on talking about, well, government and private companies, but these private companies are increasingly powerful, increasingly wealthy. And the government, for all Trump or Hegseth's bluster, seems increasingly marginalized. So I wonder whether in the long term, Anthropic's challenge to the US government might speak of the shift in power between private companies and the state.
The word power might be too big a word, but I think you're right that let's call it influence. The influence of technology companies in particular on government has increased, certainly during this administration. I think in the last administration it was the opposite due to the regulatory zeal. They went apart, but I think the influence has increased. I wouldn't characterize it as power, because I think we all know that Trump is not somebody to accede power to a third party. So he clearly is using them for his own ends as opposed to giving them authority. And personally, I think it's a good thing if the main drivers of GDP growth have a seat at the table in the conversation. That's fine. When they step over the line of thinking they are the ones who set policy, that is not fine. And I say that despite the fact that this is the Trump administration, and many people would say, well, it's better if anyone else is making policy. I don't agree with that. Democracy is founded on elected officials making policy through legislation, and you can't subvert that just because you don't like the current administration.
But again, I wonder whether technology is so powerful and is so privatized now that this is almost unavoidable. I mean, back in the nuclear age, Oppenheimer, for all his ambivalence about the nuclear bomb, couldn't say, well, I'm not going to give my bomb or my technology to the government, because he was employed by the government, because he worked for them. Now what Ahmadai has at his fingertips within Anthropic is not something that the government has. Maybe Sam Altman has it at OpenAI, and he's done this deal with the government. But who knows in future what kind of relations will exist between OpenAI and the government? So something's changed, hasn't it?
Well, there's an enduring theme that goes back maybe as long as 15, 20 years, which is the globalization of tech leads to a separation of interest from domestic corporations, which are more and more global, and national governments. And all over the world, national governments have reacted with, regulatory zeal, fines, sometimes huge fines, especially in Europe. And there is, we are living at a time in history when the nation state is too small an institution for a corporation that has a reach much greater than a nation state. And that tension is real and always arises in any globalizing setting. At the same time, it's intensified because nations are deglobalizing and shrinking back into their regional zones, and corporations are not.
Right. And so you have someone like Trump, who's a sort of a wannabe 19th century Tin Pot dictator invading countries at his will or his whim, and then forgetting about them the next week and invading somewhere else. And then you have the real powers of Anthropic or OpenAI or Google. So
yeah,
by the way,
we have a couple of viewers, one on LinkedIn, Robert Murray, who reminds us it was Edward Snowden we were trying to think about earlier.
It shows how significant he was.
And then the second one is from Scrap Metal Husband on YouTube, saying he thinks the reliance of the government on tech companies has increased. It isn't so much the tech companies' influence, it's the government relying on them.
Well, I think he's wrong. That shows the value of democratic input, Keith. I'd switch these things off. Kosler argues that we need these, he's critical of Ahmadai. I'm quoting from an ex he posted, and Putin will adhere to it, and China didn't do gain of function research and cause COVID, probably accidentally. Do you trust Putin and Xi? That's all very well, but on a day where Donald Trump has invaded or is at least declared war on Iran, I mean, one could argue, Ahmadai might, certainly a lot of people in Silicon Valley, there's not a great deal of difference between Putin and Xi and Trump.
Well, the biggest difference is the belief in, ultimately in democracy.
You keep on using this D word. You don't sound very convinced, Keith.
Well, it's certainly the case that the gains we've made in political organizations since feudalism are something to be defended and protected. That's definitely true. It is true that Putin...
That's another very vague response. I mean, we're not talking about advances since feudalism. We're talking about America in 2026.
Well, America in 2026 is dangerous because America is relatively declining as a global power, is having to rely more and more on shrinking back into its borders, hence the discussions around NATO and the EU spending more money on the military. It's a bunch of bilateral relationships. Increasing diplomacy with China becomes important, and Putin for that matter. And so a shrinking or declining power, which happens to be the world's biggest military power, clearly would be of a concern to everyone who isn't the United States. And so that's the reality. Putting into the United States government, therefore, needs to be controlled by its people in terms of what policies.
Yeah, but that's again, you sound like some civics.
Well,
that's not the way things are working in America. I mean, the vast majority of Americans are not supportive of what Trump did in Minneapolis. They're certainly not supportive of him invading and declaring war on Iran or Venezuela or Cuba or wherever else. So he won a narrow victory, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone supports what he does. And well, I mean, Ahmadai might ask, I'm not putting words into his mouth, but what's the difference between giving these weapons of mass destruction to, well, maybe not Putin, but certainly Xi versus Trump? Xi hasn't used them yet, certainly in Taiwan. It's just, it's not clear, really. I mean, you keep on mentioning democracy, but it's not convincing.
Well, I want to hear from you how you frame it. I'm trying to give you my worldview at this moment in time. I mean, I do think historically, at least, rising powers rarely resort to war. it's almost always declining powers or powers that are struggling to put paid to a previous big power that's declined, like say Germany was doing in the middle of last century.
Well, actually, it's interesting. I've got an interview coming up. I did it yesterday, and I assumed I was going to run it on Tuesday, but events have intervened with a Yale historian, Arne Westad, who's just written a book called The Coming Storm, which he compares the current world with the period before the First World War. And he compares pre-World War I Britain with America in terms of decline, and pre-World War Germany with China. So it's an interesting comparison. I
think that is an appropriate comparison at an abstract level. I mean, obviously not taking into account any of the specifics about today, but at the big picture level, China is already dominating many industries globally, and is a rising power. America is very similar to Britain, as in the pound was being questioned as a currency of world trade. Now the dollar's being questioned. And it's cyclical. And by the way, my PhD thesis was about why this happens. It happens because of economics. The old get old, and the new are
right. So I'll run that interview actually probably tomorrow. But let's get back to tech. I mean, again, it comes back to. I mean, I'm not saying anything. I'm much more sympathetic to Amadai because I see it as a political response. I mean, clearly. I mean, I don't necessarily disagree certainly with you or Khosla in theory, but in practice, we live in late February or early March 2026, and Amadai is taking position, for better or worse, on the current state of the US government, which he clearly doesn't trust, in my view, quite rightly, whether it's Trump or Hegseth. I don't think he would probably do it in a different administration. But my bigger point is that I think it does reflect the fact that these companies now, again, for better or worse, are so powerful, have so much technology and financial independence, that the fact that Amadai is willing to take the government on publicly is astonishing. And that he's kept his job. There's no rebellion. The investors in Anthropic are clearly okay with it. Sam Altman came out publicly to support him, although clearly he's using it as an opportunity to build better bridges with the current administration. But I think it speaks of the change in power between governments and corporations in the long term. That's my sense. And I don't think you got the same imbalance, to say, between the First World War. No one knows who supplied the British government, for example, with weapons. There were steel manufacturers and armament manufacturers, people who made tanks, but they don't come to mind. I think when historians look back at this period, Anthropic and OpenAI and Google and Microsoft will be major players, in some ways equally powerful to the US government.
Well, Palmer Luckey's company that produces autonomous weapons is obviously a big part of the
right.
But Andrew, I know you well enough, and your reputation on being pro-democracy is huge. I suspect you would agree with me that corporations shouldn't set policy. You might agree with, and I do too, the individual beliefs against mass surveillance and against unreliable autonomous weapons.
Yeah, and to be clear, let's just be clear, is that Amadai's position is that the government is not that the government can't use Anthropic technology. It's in particular in two areas, what he calls mass domestic surveillance and fully autonomous weapons. I mean, you asked me whether obviously we're all Democrats here, you as much as me, but he has every right in a democracy, or the Anthropic has every right in a democracy, to withhold the use of their technology to the government. That's what democracy is as well. There's no obligation, moral or economic or otherwise, to give all your technology to a government.
Yeah, but the scenario you've got to consider is if the government had agreed with him. If the government agreed to buy on those conditions, Congress is no longer setting policy
Yeah, but that's my point. Congress isn't. I mean, for better or worse, Congress is irrelevant in America today. I did a show on that last week as well, where there's a woman who's written a book called Stuck. Congress has been completely marginalized by Trump at best. It's not a player anymore. So that's just the nature of things, for better or worse. And in these power vacuums, companies like Anthropic and the other Silicon Valley leviathans are going to be more and more prominent.
Well, your statement that Congress is irrelevant can't be one that sits comfortably with you, because you're a Democrat and you want the elected.
Yeah, but it's not. Obviously, I'm not happy with the situation, but that's the reality. That's the world we're living in today.
So would you
today,
rather,
Keith, Trump has announced or he's launched an invasion of Iran. Congress might not even challenge that, let alone be able to stop it. So something's changed. Now you could have a weak Congress and a weak Silicon Valley. Those two things don't go together. But I'm not celebrating it. It's just a reality.
Let's just take it to its extreme. If public corporations started doing what happened in the war, in between the wars, which is build private armies, you'd obviously be against that. Setting policy is the first step towards having an independent, executive and legislature inside a private company. So I do think we have to draw a line and say that even if we agree with his spirit, we disagree with his attempt to set policy. I think that's fine.
Well, I don't think that's true, because again, you're taking it to the logical extreme. Just because he withholds his technology because of his ambivalence or concern about mass domestic surveillance and fully autonomous weapons, that doesn't suggest that there's going to be an Anthropic army in the future. I mean, those are two quite different things.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion on YouTube about what we're talking about. I won't read it all out, but thank you for This Is My Username and Profit Generation Lab and others for.
So who most people on your side or my side on this? I hope it's your side.
We have intelligent viewers, so I'd say they're nuanced. I'll read one. It's a nuanced situation, and I agree they have a moral
situation.
Nuanced. Sorry, and I agree that they have a moral right to withhold their technology. There are other players they can use, as they are doing. By the same token, I also see the other perspective.
So, what's the feeling down in Palo Alto, Keith? You're in the heart of Silicon Valley. I sent you this New York Times piece, Silicon Valley rallies behind Anthropic in AI clash with Trump, yesterday, from the New York Times. And you sent me back the fact that COSA disagrees. What do you think the consensus is? Or are people too busy making money and not too bothered one way or the other?
It's complicated. Silicon Valley basically splits into two kinds of libertarian: right libertarians, who are typically small government supporters of the administration, and left libertarians, who are typically bigger government supporters of welfare of various kinds. Vinod is a kind of a hybrid. He's very pro-America, militarily especially, and so he sees everything through the prism of being fearful of China. So there's a lot of different strands in Silicon Valley, and I say it's the least harmonious time that I can remember.
Well, that's good. I mean, that, again, if you want to use the D word, that reflects the fact that Silicon Valley is a democracy. The interview of the week wasn't from Keen on America this week. I suggested everyone should read Ezra Klein's interview of Anthropic co-founder Jack Clark on the New York Times. I thought it was an excellent interview, partly because it tells us about the kind of mentality or perhaps culture of senior people at a company like Anthropic. Do you think there's a great deal of difference? I mean, half these people at Anthropic had been at OpenAI. There isn't really that much of a difference. And Amadai, of course, began at OpenAI. There isn't much of a difference really between Anthropic and OpenAI, is there? Do you think culturally or politically?
I think emotionally there is. There's companies which are striking in their preparedness to work with the administration. Apple stands out there. I mean, Tim Cook is the least likely person you would imagine to do that, but is doing it. So there's companies that
to
are
many people's disappointment.
right, and then there's other companies where the emotional core, like Anthropics, is prepared to put politics into business, and arguably to their own detriment. And both exist. I don't think there's a single. I think if there was a trend, it's the Tim Cook trend is the strongest.
But I would argue again, the idea of putting politics into business is then again the nature of things, especially in America in 2026. If you decide to do business with the government, if you decide to go to Mar-a-Lago or DC, by definition, you're being involved in politics. Trump, for better or worse, is forcing Silicon Valley to be political.
Yeah, but there's
it's not possible to separate business and politics in early 2026.
But there is a way to do that, Andrew. I mean, Anthropic has a lot of money.
So who's the model then? Who is navigating these two worlds of politics and business most successfully? If it's not Amadai,
I think NVIDIA. I mean, it's amazing to me that NVIDIA got Trump to agree he could sell to China. I think NVIDIA is doing a great job of navigating on its own behalf. And, that is the democratic way to do it. It's to lobby. You can also build PACs and put money into them for your preferred point of view, which Anthropic could. It's a different.
What do you mean? But who wants that? You mean lobbyists in DC? And I would argue that what Amadai has done is actually raise this. I mean, most people hadn't really thought that much about mass domestic surveillance or fully autonomous weapons until he brought it up. So it's an act of politics. And I think a lot of people expect some sort of deal down the line on this because the government probably needs Anthropic more than Anthropic needs the government.
Let's imagine that there was a democratic government and a company that builds autonomous weapons only agreed to sell to the government if they said they would use them. Okay, you disagree with that company. Would you say it's doing the right thing? Probably not. So I think here bias gets in the way of logic.
Yeah, I mean that's a good a good counter argument. I'm not sure I wouldn't necessarily admire them, but they have every right to do it. So if one of these new teal-backed organizations refused to give their technology to Biden, what if he was using it for international peace, that they were objecting to it? I think everyone would be shocked, but they have every right to do it.
Yeah.
I mean, if Palantir decided that they didn't want to share their technology with a Democratic administration. But again, I think what it does, and again, stepping back, and I'm repeating myself here, is it speaks to the fact that these companies now can speak to the government as almost as equals. So whether it would be Palantir standing up to a Democratic government or Anthropic standing up to a Republican one or a MAGA one, it's a new reality. You mentioned Cook. It's an interesting one. And I think Cook is a representative of the old world. But what's bewildering to a lot of people is why wouldn't Apple stand up to Trump?
Well, they have no interest. Apple also works with the Chinese government. Apple doesn't try to pretend it can circumvent national law and governments ever. It's very disciplined about having a voice without setting policy everywhere in the world. And it gets criticized in China for acceding to government policy. But that's what you have to do, as long as you have a world of nation states with legal systems.
So you're admiring that? I mean, Sergey Brin pulled Google out of China and has always been very critical of Google's involvement with any authoritarian government. I mean, these are realities. You have to take a position one way or the other. So you're suggesting that the Apple model of doing business with everyone is more acceptable than Google or Anthropic?
Not only more acceptable, it's the only realistic way to exist in a multipolar world of nation states with different legal systems. If you want to be a global business, which all big businesses are, you have to work with an array of different legal systems in order to even be able to exist. And you can still pursue politics, but you pursue it outside of your sales process and your product process. You pursue it in civil society.
Yeah, but there's no civil society in China. Google doesn't do a great deal of business. I don't think they do any business in China. They're still a $3 or $4 trillion company.
Andrew, have you been to China? The idea that there's no civil society in China is ludicrous.
Yeah, but Google. But my point is that Google survives as a very viable company without doing business in China.
So what? That doesn't change the point.
Well, you just made the point that you have to, because that's the only way a company can operate. I can say you can take positions. You can say, well, China's beyond the pale for one reason or another, or Russia's beyond the pale.
No, I agree with that. And that's why I said Anthropic is doing this to its detriment. It is taking a position. It's a wrong position, and it's going to lose significant tailwinds as a company because of the decision. And as Google did in China, Google lost.
It doesn't seem to have harmed Google as a company, though.
Well, you have to do the math on what it could have made in China if it didn't do it to know.
So are you, I mean, I know this is taking it to the ludicrous level, but I mean, you suggesting that companies should just do businesses with all governments at any time because they're businesses and they're in the business of making money, and that's just the nature of things, and you have to adapt or calibrate even with evil regimes?
I think, it's fine to choose not to trade with the government as Google did. It's not fine to say, I'll trade if you change your policy to this.
Is that what Amadai is doing, though?
He is, absolutely is doing that.
So what is he saying? What is he saying that Hegseth and the Department of War should be doing?
He's putting rules in place for the use of his technology that the customer must agree to in order to buy it. And when the customer is a government, that means you're putting yourself ahead of national rule of law.
Yeah, well, as I said,
I mean, the rule of law does govern.
Given what's happening in the US, a lot of people would say that the national rule of law is certainly precarious in the US. Let's move on. I think it's an interesting debate, and it's complicated, but important. The other news this week was the Citrini research came out with a white paper, which had a great deal of impact on Wall Street, very dramatic. Tell us about the Citrini research, Keith, and why it had such a dramatic impact when it comes to AI and jobs.
Well, it was a fictional extrapolation of over the next 2 years of what happens if AI succeeds. So it wasn't doomer as in AI will fail. It's AI will succeed and lots of white collar jobs will go. And then other things will kick in. And it concluded that the economy would collapse, at least initially. GDP would collapse. And software would disappear as a item. And, that's enough of the flavor. I'd recommend everyone goes and reads it. It is in this week's newsletter, thatwastheweek.com. And which, by the way, is not yet published. It'll be published later today. And there was a massive counter reaction to it, saying it was simplifying and over extrapolating and so on and so forth. But it did lead to a very large crash in the software part of the stock market on Monday, which has recovered since, by the way.
And the other piece of news, which is, and not everyone, of course, agrees, you link with a piece by Noah Smith, very good columnist, which suggests that this Citrini post is just what he calls a scary bedtime story. But if you have enough scary bedtime stories, people begin to believe them.
Yeah. Well, look, the truth is nobody really knows what the next 2 years look like. We all have models in our head of what we think will happen. And the range of those models, depending on each individual, it goes from a Gary Marcus kind of view of the world, which is this is all BS and nothing's going to happen, through to this is real and there won't be any white collar jobs 2 years from now, and then robotics will kick in and there won't be any manual jobs. And then their opinion divides further into that's a good thing or that's a catastrophic thing.
Yeah, but that's it's not all fictional, because the other big news, and certainly to be read in parallel with the Citrini research report, and this is a real world case where Jack Dorsey at Square announced cutting 40% of its workforce because of AI, and overnight his stock jumped 25%. So this is having a real impact. This isn't just scary bedtime stories.
My point of view is that it will make a big impact. I think, first and foremost in software engineering, I think white collar jobs are somewhat safe because the probabilistic nature of current AI means that there have to be humans in the loop, but arguably less humans in the loop. That can certainly be true. And we are on a trend where the social contract between capital and labor, ultimately, if you extrapolate, there is no labor. And so capitalism itself morphs into a capital-only economy where labor is no longer required. That seems a logical extrapolation, and that keys into the narrative that others are putting on the table, especially Elon Musk, about the end of money.
Yeah, I'm not going to go. That's my red flag. We're not going to go into that one. But finally, I wonder whether, in Amadai's mind at least, this issue, if it is indeed true, if indeed X%, whatever it is, 30, 40, 50% of white collar work is going to get lost in the next 2 or 3 or 4 years, at what point does Amadai say, it's not just mass domestic surveillance and fully autonomous weapons, it's the use of AI to destroy jobs? We're very uncomfortable with that. He's already articulated that, although hasn't taken a formal position. It'll be interesting to see how Amadai responds to this. And I mean, whether you like him or not, I think you've got to admire the guy for at least being out there and making himself vulnerable. He could have done a Tim Cook and just shut up and taken his clients' money.
I don't actually admire him. I think he's unsophisticated in diplomacy and negotiation. And I think
if he's unsophisticated, then I rather like that. Maybe we should admire his lack of sophistication, in contrast to, say, Tim Cook, who I guess in your mind is sophisticated, although not much of a moral model, I think, for people.
Well, I think if you talk to Tim Cook and ask him his personal views, you'd agree with almost all of them, if not all of them.
But isn't that the point, that you would agree and you'd like him, and he's clearly a progressive character? He probably behaves very well in his private life, and yet he's not willing to stand up to evil.
Well,
as the CEO of I mean, this comes back, Keith, to the what we've been talking about in the context of being CEO of Apple.
No, because I think you underestimate the extent to which innovation requires the ability to execute, and the ability to execute requires negotiating with governments. And successful innovators have to be excellent diplomats. They have to be.
This is a subject that is certainly not going away. An interesting week, an important week, I think, in Amadai challenging the government, and in finally Jack Dorsey being the little kid in The Emperor Has No Clothes and announcing that he's going to get rid of 40% of the people in his company because they're no longer of any value. We shall see, Keith. There'll be more of this to come. That was the week in technology, the last day of February 28th. I will see you, Keith, in March. Keep well, keep employed, keep thinking.
Bye, everyone.